Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Good evening, welcome. I'm Peter Curti, Research Fellow in the Religion and the Free Society program at the Centre for Independent Studies. It's my great pleasure to welcome those of you who are here in St Leonard's, as well as those of you joining us via the live stream for this evening's event where our guest is Andrew West. I'll just say that the event is being recorded, so if you'd prefer your image or your voice not to be captured, please don't ask a question at the end when we come to Q&A a little later on. And if you are here and would like to ask a question, simply raise your hand and someone will come to you with a microphone. And if you're watching the live stream and would like to join us at the Q&A and ask a question, then you're welcome to do so via Twitter by joining us at the hashtag CIS events, so hashtag CIS events. And I might ask you at this point just to check that your mobile phone is switched to at least vibrate. Well, Andrew West is a journalist, formerly with the Sydney Morning Herald. He's currently, as I'm sure you know, the host of the ABC Radio National's Religion and Ethics Report, a program which has a tremendously wide scope and examines each week questions of faith, religion and society with intelligence and depth and rigour. This evening, Andrew turns his attention to the place of tradition in our society. At a time when progressivism in politics is so fashionable, coupled with a determination on the part of some in public life to dismantle anything that impedes the cause of reform, I think it's timely to examine the concept of tradition more closely. Is tradition worth defending? Perhaps not. But if it is worth defending, why is that so? And what value does it have in the life of a free society? Andrew West will help us answer those questions. Will you please welcome him to the Centre for Independent Studies?
Thank you, Peter. I'm very honoured to be here at the Centre for Independent Studies, and I acknowledge Professor Stephen Schwartz and Peter Coleman, who I've known for many years. It's a great honour to be in Peter's company as well. It's a pleasure to come to the Centre for Independent Studies, which I think is Australia's premier think tank. I don't say that in any to indicate any philosophical or ideological preference. I simply make the point that it is a place where argument, not simply assertion, matters. When I was the acting opinion editor at the Sydney Morning Herald, we were always pleased to have contributions from scholars at the CIS, as I say, because they were arguments, not merely assertions. They were provocative, they were argumentative, they were often disagreeable, but it was always, often disagreeable to some, but it was always a pleasure to run those pieces. And I have a standing invitation for any CIS scholars whose work traverses this area of faith and public policy to be on the Religion and Ethics Report. Father Peter has already been on our program. I wanted tonight to talk a little bit about tradition more in the realm of commentary. I now work for the ABC, so I don't really have a public opinion, although there is, I'm sure, a paper trail and a digital trail of things that I have said in my previous life when I've been a columnist at various private sector newspapers. But on this occasion, I really wanted to talk and make the case that tradition is vital to a free society in this sense. And I'm reminded of three particular examples. The first is those of you who follow the conventions of Parliament, and Peter would know this having served as a distinguished state and federal MP. There's a wonderful tradition of covering the head with a piece of paper if a point of order is taken during a division. This is seen as rather quaint. It's meant to represent the time when MPs would uncover their heads to speak. So if you were to not be confused with someone who was attempting to get the call to speak, you would wear your hat. So the MPs now cover their heads with a piece of paper. It always makes the news because it looks a little fuddy-duddy, because it looks a little quaint. There's a second tradition in Westminster that you may know about, but probably not. Did you know that it's actually impossible to resign your seat in the House of Commons? Any member who wants to leave the House of Commons has to do things. They have to take something called the Chiltern Hundreds or the Manor of Northstead. That is, you have to accept one of these two pecuniary positions afforded by the Crown that automatically disqualify you from serving in the House of Commons. And the third tradition in the House of Commons is that of the three-line whip, where the political leaders insist, the parties that have endorsed you, that have campaigned for you, insist that you follow the party line. Now, I rank these traditions in a sort of ascending order of importance, because to me they all represent something. The first is merely a tradition that we keep alive for the sake of keeping alive, the paper on the head. The second, on the question of not being able to resign your seat in the House of Commons, you have to, as I say, accept one of these appointments by the Crown and be automatically disqualified from service in the Commons, is important because it emphasises the notion of obligation and duty. It was thought that members of the House of Commons had a duty to live out or serve out their term for which they were elected. And there was always, and when they developed the idea that one took the Chiltern Hundreds or the Manor of Northstead appointment, it had something to do with a subtle pressure, a subtle shame that one was deserting one's post in the Commons. Nothing particularly overt, but it was there to remind you that what you're doing wasn't totally kosher. And the third tradition of the three-line whip was about your obligation to the manifesto that you had made, the obligation in a sense that you had made to the electors who voted for you based on a set of principles to which you had said that you adhere. So I think these are good examples of tradition that emphasise notions of duty and responsibility. Of course, not all tradition, I acknowledge, is healthy. Some of it's quite oppressive. Some of it is very, very restrictive on human freedom. I first came across and began to think about the idea and the importance of tradition as a teenager when, as a lover of musical theatre, I heard the great musical by Jerry Brock and Joseph Stein, The Fiddler on the Roof. And that opens with the song about tradition, the song about the Jewish traditions, which are quite enriching and keep alive community life. But there's a slightly dark side to it as well, because you'll recall that one of the daughters in Fiddler on the Roof wants to marry her childhood sweetheart, who's a poor tailor, I think. And yet her father, Tevye, the milkman, wants her to marry the wealthy, I think he's a butcher, and he sends her off to Yentl the matchmaker. Well, it all ends in tears. It ends in absolute meltdown when his other daughter falls in love with a non-Jewish man, and she's effectively exiled from the community. And this, to me, I thought was an example of a somewhat harsh and restrictive tradition. But I could nonetheless see the point that this was about a community under siege, needing to emphasise its own and protect its own identity. But not all traditions, as I say, are necessarily healthy. The tradition that I like is a kind of amended version of William F. Buckley's great statement when he was setting up the National Review, where he said that part of the mission would be, and I say this only in an amended sense, to stand athwart history and yell stop. Now, I like Buckley's argument in this sense, that the purpose of tradition is to be a check on fads and fashion. It's to be a check on, at times, foolishly radical impulses. It's not necessarily to stand in the way of logical human progress. The thing that troubled me always about Buckley's injunction was that he was writing in the 50s at a time when the civil rights movement was beginning to gather pace, and that was a movement that I do think had great moral force. But nonetheless, there was something appealing about Buckley's notion of tradition and conservatism as a check, not as a block, but as a check on some of those impulses. My favourite tradition, or my favourite sense of tradition, probably is a blend of the thinking of both William F. Buckley and his great adversary, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was described in his diaries as a man of 1960s values and 1950s tastes. I think it's probably more early 1960s values. That was, he did support the agenda of the civil rights movement and the war on poverty. By the end of the 1960s, he was in the era of the me generation and the hippies and the yippies and those who followed in the early 70s. Schlesinger was beginning to worry about the disuniting of America and the good things that were being lost in the 50s. And 30 years later, people like Robert Putnam were writing about the loss of those good civic institutions and civic values that had come through in the 1950s. I see tradition in many senses, and this goes directly to the heart of what Peter said, as the guardian of a free society, because, as Burke said, freedom is never absolute. He spoke of an ordered liberty. He spoke of society as a social fabric. So tradition guarantees your freedom against my freedom. My freedom has its limits because of traditions that we place on it. And in doing so, we guarantee everyone else's freedom. So tradition, I think, imposes limits on our behavioural excesses. The argument, I think, the good political argument to have, and the one especially for conservatives and those who believe in a free society, is whether those limits ought to be state-imposed or whether they're brought to bear by social convention or peer pressure. It's not an argument that I propose to resolve, it's just the argument that hangs out there. I want to look specifically tonight at traditions in three areas: the Church, and specifically the Church of England, in higher education, and more generally in politics. Now, in the area that I cover, we've spoken recently a lot about the stresses and strains on the Church of England, the Anglican Church. And I suggest that the Anglican Church is under stress. I don't use the word threat because it's such a loaded word, but it's under stress in two ways, from both its evangelical and liberal wings. We can see it here in the Diocese of Sydney, but also more broadly in the Anglican world, where the pressure to be with the zeitgeist in many respects, on style of worship, on one's the way one expresses one's faith, is placing stress on the broad worldwide Anglican communion. And nowhere, I think, is this more obvious than in the absence of an ordered form of worship, an ordered form of service in the Anglican Church. As I say, this is not limited to the Diocese of Sydney. It's an issue. I'm not saying it's a problem, but it's an issue increasingly in the UK, in many of the dioceses there. I think many people have recognised that this is a challenge for the Anglican Church, because here in Sydney there has been an attempt to restore the notion of a prayer book, some form of ordered service. I don't know how successful it will be, because we're now into our second generation of clergy in the Anglican Diocese of Sydney that are not accustomed to kind of prayer book Anglicanism. But why is the notion of the prayer book, that tradition, important? Because it gives the Anglican Church its unique identity. I'm not in any sense getting into a theological argument here, or in any sense questioning the theology. But what I am saying is that that tradition of a prayer book, of an order of service, of hymns, ancient and modern, gave the Anglican Church its universal quality. It is in that sense like the Catholic Church. What we see increasingly, though, is a kind of stress, and that is churches abandoning the names of their patron saints, even though the Anglican Church itself believes in the communion of saints, the Holy Catholic Church. It's all part of the creed. The other stress on the Church comes from what I would say is the theologically liberal wing, and this is this is again a chipping away at the unity and tradition of the Anglican Church. This is most prominent in the United States and Canada, where you have theological adventurism. Now, it's one thing to be, I think, a legitimate theological liberal, to have that inquiring mind, to question the teachings, but it has strayed in the United States beyond the boundaries of unity. And I'm not talking here, as one might automatically think, about the vexed issue of the ordination and full ministry of gay and lesbian people. I'm thinking more about, if you like, the straying from basic Christian doctrine that we've seen in parts of the Episcopal Church in America. And this is evident in a number of cases. Some years ago, or last year, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch reported that the Reverend Steve Lawler of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in St. Louis, Missouri, had decided, as part of his Lenten exercises, to give up Christianity. He had in fact decided that he was going to adopt the exercises of the Islamic fasting rituals. Now, I stand before you today as someone who is totally in favour of interfaith cooperation. But it did seem rather jarring to many in the worldwide Anglican Communion when the Reverend Lawler decided that he was going to adopt for Lent the Islamic fasting rituals. Over on the west coast in Seattle, the Reverend Annie Holmes Redding held two jobs. One was as director, or held two positions. One was as director of faith formation at St. Mark's Episcopal Cathedral. The other was as a practicing Muslim. Again, I have no problem at all with good, solid interfaith relations. The post-9/11 world calls on us, that is an obligation on us, of all faiths, to reach understanding and goodwill. But these did seem extraordinary adventures in Anglican theology. And of course, many would argue that this itself comes from the extreme or the particular liberalism of the Episcopal Church leadership in America itself. After all, the presiding bishop, Catherine Jefferts Schori, has argued that she is not convinced of a singular way to salvation for Christians. Now, that does seem to be an odd thing for a Christian leader to say. It's the sort of thing that a secular scholar can make. It's a totally legitimate critique to make. But nonetheless, as I say, it is rather extraordinary for an Anglican leader, indeed the presiding bishop of her church, to venture into that territory. And this is where I think the real strains and tearing of the great Anglican tradition have been coming, far more so than the question of the ordination of women, which is not considered an issue over which there ought to be schism. And probably it's even more serious than the vexed question of sexuality. Indeed, people like the Reverend Dr. George Conger, who's an evangelical Anglican priest, a writer, we've had him as a guest on our program, make the point that the evangelical wing of the Anglican Church can withstand a liberal position on the question of ordaining same-sex clergy. But what they can't withstand is a failure to agree on basic Christian doctrine. So that's where I see tradition being tested. I'm not prepared to say it's being undermined, but certainly being tested in the religious world. The other area, the second of the three areas that I want to discuss on the question of tradition, is higher education. Because I see the three areas of religion, education and politics as so central to a free and civilised society. And I'm going to annoy, I think, on this score, both the left and the right in my critique of higher education. Some time ago, the ABC had a forum on its program Big Ideas about whether a university degree was now worthless. It was a good and feisty debate, but it was the wrong question. The question really ought to be whether the humanities and the social sciences have been devalued. And I would argue that they've been devalued by stresses and tensions, by this threat to tradition from both the left and the right. The first threat comes from the faddishness of the intellectual left. I myself am am the beneficiary of a very good and rigorous education. I had a very traditional undergraduate education in political science and history at the University of Sydney, and then I was fortunate enough to win a scholarship to go to Columbia University in the United States. And before going to Columbia, I read about the history of Columbia. It had a great and rich history, but I was particularly interested in the mid-90s, in the great upheavals of the late 60s. And one of the things that I discovered with the movements that occupied university campuses was there were great moral questions there, questions of war and peace, questions of civil rights, but there was this rather, I thought, almost self-defeating movement, and that was that students thought that they should determine their courses. And I always thought that was rather odd, because after all, what does an 18-year-old know that he or she hasn't been taught? I always thought that the purpose of universities was to listen to people who knew things, imbibe that, argue, develop an argument, develop a position, but a position grounded in fact. So it did strike me that in the late 1960s, when one of the principal demands of the student movement, and particularly SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, was that we should determine what we learn. Well, everyone knows that if you ask most students what they'll choose the subjects that they love, they'll choose the issues that they love, but they won't necessarily be the most rigorous forms of education. And as a consequence, I think, over the last 30, 40 years, we've had an outgrowth in courses. Anything, I've always believed, any course that ends in the word theory or studies is problematic. And of course, the poster boy for this, what I would probably venture to suggest, go so far as saying is an almost intellectual corruption, was the course at Staffordshire University in David Beckham studies. This is not I'm not the first person to raise this. As I said, the David Beckham studies has become the poster boy for this kind of cultural movement. But then again, as I say, again, it is an outgrowth of the faddishness that has occurred on the left. The other threat, though, however, to the higher education intellectual tradition, I think, comes from the marketisation on the right. I always remember some years ago when Brendan Nelson was the higher education minister in the Howard government, and he gave an interview to Four Corners, and I cheered when he lamented that we had these courses in makeup artistry for drag queens and surfboard making. I thought he's right. It's a tremendous critique of all that is wrong with higher education. Golf course management was another. But I did want to follow through with this question. These courses exist because there is perceived to be a market for them, that there are people who are willing to pay for a course like... there are people who are willing to pay for what was once a good old-fashioned vocational skill, like being a makeup artist in the theatre, and give it the patina of a tertiary education. So it did strike me that Brendan Nelson needed to be a little more self-reflective about the kind of culture that has been created by marketising higher education, by suggesting that every form of education needs an immediate economic payoff. My friend Gerard Henderson once had a subtle dig at me. Actually, it wasn't quite so subtle, but I say that with genuine affection for Gerard. Gerard once had a dig at me when I wrote a newspaper column saying about the history wars that if you have a problem with bad history, blame John Howard. And I don't mean that in a particularly nasty way, because there's actually, I've later come to realise there was much to admire in John Howard standing for principle, such that it would ultimately cost him office. But my critique was that when you create a society in which everything needs to have an immediate buck-raking function, then subjects that are integral, I think, to human understanding, like history, where their value is only revealed over decades of life and work and discussion and public interaction and civic life, they tend to suffer. So that, I say, is the second area where I believe the tradition is under stress. The third and final area that I want to discuss, the third and final tradition, that I believe is so important. And I'm, as I say it now, conscious in the presence of a very distinguished former parliamentarian, Peter Coleman, is the idea of politics as public service. In 1918, I think it was Max Weber who developed the notion of politics as a vocation. But it was a critique, by the way, of Weber. He was developing a critique of a political class that lived off politics, whether it was a bureaucratic class or ultimately people like myself who covered politics on and off for 15 years. It was a class that was living off politics. But of course, if only we had stopped with Weber, because it's got much, much worse now. Because politics is no longer a vocation, it's a career. And a career implies something which you enter straight out of university or school, but increasingly these days out of university, and never leave. So people like Peter, who was a distinguished writer and journalist, who edited 2 newspapers who edited 2 magazines and a newspaper, I venture to suggest Peter would not be pre-selected for Parliament these days, because we've developed politics, as I say, as a career. This is a critique that's best made by my friend Rodney Cavalier. For some years, he's been arguing that we've evolved a political class that joins a political party based not on the values that most closely align to their own, but on geography, where the person lives, which political party offers the shortest route to promotion. In the Labor side of politics, this has become particularly egregious because people who join trade unions, which I think are very important institutions in a civil society, by the way, but I think those institutions are devalued by the rampant careerism that's occurred in unions. People taking jobs in trade unions, then accepting a high-paid position on a ministerial staff, a seat in Parliament, and seeing that the next step is naturally a place in the cabinet, in the ministry, if not the leadership itself. We've lost the idea that politics ought to be a defined period of public service in one's life, where you bring to that job, you bring to that parliamentary representation several years of experience and accumulated knowledge. I believe that part of our problem with politics is the abandonment of this tradition, because if you don't have a skill, if you don't have a profession, if you don't have an experience to which you can return after politics, if you don't have, as my mother once said to me when I once said I wanted to be an actor, she said, well, and my working class father said, for God's sake, Lynn, tell him not to be an actor. And she said, well, it's fine to be an actor, just have something to fall back on. I say to journalists, young people want to be journalists now, it's fine to be a journalist, just have something to fall back on. But if you don't have that something to fall back on, and you're in politics, then it limits your independence, it limits your own ability, it limits your ability to take a stand on principle, it limits your ability to be, I think, a faithful representative of both your constituents and also of the movement or the political tendency or the philosophy that you represent. So in these 3 areas that I believe are critical to a civilised and free society, I believe that tradition is being, if not undermined, then it is certainly under stress. Although in the last case, on the question of politics, I do believe that our political system is undermined thoroughly by the abandonment of the tradition of politics as public service. It was, as I say, Edmund Burke who developed the idea of an ordered liberty, or at least evolved the idea of an ordered liberty. And as I say, that liberty, my liberty, is only assured by your liberty and vice versa. And tradition, by placing limits on our behaviour and limits on our practice, by placing those limits on our behaviour and practice, and by, I'm searching for the phrase, not something that a radio presenter should do, because we can't afford these long passages, long silences. But I believe that these traditions guarantee all of our freedoms but freedom with responsibility. And in that sense, I think they're vital to a free and civilised society. So I'm happy now to take everyone's comments or questions or have a discussion.